Oop, says that there's some kind of an internal something. Are we live?
Says it's now streaming live on YouTube.
It does. Okay, good.
Yeah, up on the left-hand corner.
Oh, okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and set the recording. I don't hear it a second time on this setup, so that's cool. All right, I'm going to mute everyone and then unmute you, Andrea. And there we go. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Thank you. Yes, we're off and running, and we're live on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for being here. As I mentioned before, I'm in Florida at my daughter's place, and so the setup was a little bit different, which is awesome. We may have a dog, or probably not the cats, but the dogs, they love me to death, so they may come up and lick me a little bit while I'm sitting here. Don't be surprised. I won't be. Okay, and this week I want to thank you, Andrea Fraze, for being our guest teacher and co-host. It's great to have you on this broadcast. We're going to start off with consciousness is self-luminous.
Yeah.
And what do you think about this first chapter, Andrea?
Well, you know what's really, really interesting is the last time I was on, the first chapter I did on page 91 was called Consciousness is Self-Luminous.
Oh,
if you go back to page 91, you will see when it takes out a few things, it's almost word for word. At the beginning, it starts with exactly the same sentences. The mirror of consciousness is the screen on which everything is experienced, and at the same time, it is what experience is that which experiences everything. If you look on page 91, it's the same thing, and then it goes on to say, so this is like this great review. We even use the same title, and the other chapter I'm doing this week is on freedom, which is also what I did last time I was on, but the language. So I think, Grace would like me to spend a little time on these things.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I guess it's and Rupert does make a point of when things are important to review them and put them together in different words with different emphasis. But this idea that consciousness is self-luminous, and we can say that even, when somebody smiles, you can feel a luminosity to that and light. But for consciousness to be self-luminous, it is because all there is consciousness. So of course it's self-luminous. It's self-aware, it's self-knowing, it is everything. So it would also have to be that. And what I noticed in this particular book is we keep being brought back to where there's no space for anything but consciousness, no space for anything but awareness and knowing, over and over again. And it's done in lots of words, and it's done with lots of motifs and metaphors and stories and other authors, and it's really beautiful because it keeps you engaged. But this whole idea that the image that appears in the mirror is made of the mirror is also part of what he started with before. So whatever appears in consciousness can only be made of consciousness. And he states it right there. But this has become so clear to me over and over again that all there is consciousness. And that consciousness is free to take any form it chooses out of an infinity of possibilities.
Right.
Which was part of what I brought forth last time we were on. And here it is again. And that consciousness is transparent, and it can't be seen as an object. So in the same way that what is in the glass mirror can't be seen unless an object is being reflected in it. So consciousness is the screen in which we see all things. And I thought that this Zoom call is a perfect metaphor for that, because there's only one consciousness. We all share it. We all think we have these individual consciousness, but we don't. So it's sort of like this one screen, and we're all sharing it. And consciousness is involved with every single thought that everyone on the screen is having, every thought, every feeling, every sensation. It's all happening at the same time. But in our own idea of ourself, our own edifice, which is part of what we're going to talk about today too, the belief systems that we construct, are they really a fact?
Yeah.
Or
so does this mean that you're me talking to me in a woman's body?
Yes. How's it feel?
Nice. Hey, we're looking pretty good.
Really
we're looking pretty good today.
Yeah.
Right. Nice. Nice.
So
I like that idea.
Yeah, one of the things that keeps coming up for me is we tend to get, the ego is so serious about this. And I feel that, we've really forgotten how to have fun in the mystery of it all, and the unfolding of it all. And as we become a little more relaxed in our awareness of over time, the idea that and as I have my clients say, because we always talk about, and it says in here too, when we get identified as the object we call, I see, I hear, and that's that egoic I, or the separated self. But one way, and Rupert knows that and has talked about how there has to be this process where you kind of start there and you go netty, me, not me. And that you have, like some people just want to get there. And I really think that's the ego itself. It's like, can you just give me the answer? I want to be enlightened. And it doesn't happen that way, because we have to come through a process of understanding through direct experience. And once you have a direct experience, you have a truth that will be with you always. And even if there's some residue of an old belief, you're not triggered by it anymore. It's like the example, 4 + 4 = 5. And you can be taught that, domesticated into the idea of, or conditioned, domesticated. So we're domesticated like animals through, punishment and reward. And so we learn this world through that way. And to undo that, we have to do it through awareness. We can't do it through the mind, but the mind can serve. And Rupert talks and touches all these points in these 3 chapters that we're going to work on today. So in that process, so if we use this form, the Zoom form, we see how consciousness is seeing all of us simultaneously, at the same time, all at once. But our idea of ourselves as being separated from consciousness, it finds that very hard to believe that consciousness could know all our thoughts. And we go through this process of, okay, so I'm not the body, but I still feel like the body. And I want to know, I really want to know myself.
Well, but it actually sees, it doesn't see all of us, it sees itself in all of us.
Right, but I'm explaining it from the point of view of getting the mind to come along with me. So if the mind is being seen and not gotten rid of, we understand that it is all consciousness. But again, we have to bring it, we actually have to kind of bring ourselves along, because consciousness can forget itself and remember itself. And one of the ways it remembers itself is it uses objects.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
And it has the freedom to take any shape that it wants, but it's always knowing that it is consciousness. It only seems when we identify ourselves as a body and a separate self with a separate mind that that's not true. Because that mind has limitations and boundaries and can't imagine being able to be everything, see everything, know everything. So we kind of have to bring ourselves along, this separated self. We have to encourage it to come along. And I find humor is a really good way to do it. I can laugh at myself instead of being, giving myself a punishing thought. So that's really important. And so this self-illuminating, I think is, again, is that screen in which we see everything. It's like, even if you imagine being in the movie theater, which we've used the metaphor many times, but the theater is dark, there is a screen, and if you look up, you don't see, through the movie theater, you don't see any figures flying through the air onto the screen. You see light. You just see light coming out of this form, and there's light behind the film that's projected on. So we're sort of like the film. Consciousness is a light that projects and then sees itself on its own screen. Pretty cool. We are our own movie.
Yes, and that's how it's self-illuminating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Because it's its own consciousness. It can take any form it wants. So if it wants light, it can be light. If it wants to be thinking, sensations, anything.
Yeah. On this first page, 177, it says on the fourth paragraph,
right,
fifth paragraph down, consciousness is transparent and cannot be seen as an object.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that the glass out of which the mirror is made cannot be seen unless an object is being reflected in it.
And then the next one says consciousness is always perceiving itself in the presence and in the absence of an object.
Yes.
So it says in the next paragraph down, so when we experience an object, it is consciousness that is experiencing itself as an apparent object. And an object is one of consciousness's modes of self-knowing.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that contradictory to the fifth paragraph almost? Is it almost giving a concession to the fifth paragraph?
So when an object is present, whether that object is a thought, a sensation, or a perception, the presence of the object enables us to perceive consciousness.
Yeah.
That is, it enables consciousness to perceive itself, to experience itself. It's a
so so the fifth paragraph down says it cannot be seen unless an object is being reflected in it. So it's the object that brings a reflection of consciousness, it isn't seeing consciousness, it's seeing a reflection of consciousness.
It's seeing itself as an object. It's taking the form as an object, but it's still always seeing itself. The object is conscious too.
And as it sees itself, it also knows itself.
Right. It's using it to remember itself. Or remember, it can identify or disidentify with anything.
But it doesn't lose itself in its...
No, it's always present.
Right.
That's what it's saying. It's always present. It says right here, the present.
It can seem to lose itself because as we give attention, as consciousness, as we give attention to the I am, and consciousness divests itself as the object of experience, it actually can seemingly lose itself. Yes?
It's
Can you hear me?
Yes. I just always see it as consciousness seeing itself, whether it's a form, not a form, it just always knows itself. The separated self believes that it's separate. And when consciousness has to collapse into itself in order to even become the self. And
right. So consciousness.
So then it goes into the world as a subject and sees objects. Yeah. But it's still all consciousness. There's no separation from it. But we believe that there is. So as long as we believe that there is, we can use the objects to help the consciousness remember itself again.
Yes.
I believe that's what you're saying.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it says down at the bottom of the page, the last sentence, we could say that the transparent medium of consciousness is colored by the appearance of an object.
Right, like we're the coloring right now of consciousness, every one of us.
Right.
It's consciousness, but all colored as seeming apparent forms. With a thought can be an object, is an objective way for consciousness to remember itself too. Yes. So when it's talking about, it says, unlike the mirror, the transparent glass, consciousness is conscious. It perceives, it experiences itself all the time, whether or not objects are present. And that's exactly what it's saying before. Consciousness is the experiencing itself as an apparent object. And on the next page, third paragraph, it says consciousness is conscious. It perceives, it experiences itself all the time, whether or not an objects are present. So consciousness does not need a knower outside of itself in order to be known. And there's nothing outside of consciousness. So nor does it need the presence of an object to know itself. It does not need a body or a mind in order to know itself.
Right.
Because consciousness knows itself before it knows anything else. Everything arises out of that consciousness. And consciousness is creating it as it goes, moment to moment. It's choosing any form to identify with out of the infinite possibilities over and over again. So consciousness knows itself prior to the experience of the body-mind, and this knowledge is continuous and ever-present. Objects do not obscure it or veil it, they reveal it. More than that, they shine with that very knowledge. And so that's what, Rupert's really talking about the self-luminousness is that awareness of consciousness knowing itself. That's what I get from that. And that's the luminousness that shines through without words. It's like it's like love is not an entity, it is this intangible thing. Consciousness is as well, or awareness is and knowing is. It's like, but when it's there, we all know what it is because we are it. We remember ourselves in those moments. Like we had that instantaneous understanding, there's this knowing, and we go, oh, it didn't have to come out of a book. There's a little part in here too where it talks about parroting things before, like some teachers parrot things rather than actually have a direct experience of it.
Yes.
And last time I was on, I said that, and there was something, it felt a little off to me that maybe that wasn't a great thing, but I also feel you have to start somewhere. And I feel like sometimes repeating things, even if you don't understand them, over time, what happens is awareness arises out of awareness, arises the understanding of it. For instance, I use the example of Rupert saying, only awareness is aware, only knowing knows, and only consciousness is conscious. And I remember when I first heard that, my mind was like, what? No, I'm the conscious one. Consciousness is up here in this head, inside this body, and everything else is outside of that. But I kept repeating it to myself because there was something about it that was so intriguing to an aspect of myself that wanted to understand. And so I kept repeating it. And I remember sharing with you that on a bicycle ride one day, I said it, and it was like instantaneous understanding. It's like the 4 + 4 doesn't equal 5 anymore. 4 + 4 is 8. Yes. And it was like that. But so I do believe it is important to take concepts and repeat them to yourself. And not beat yourself up for not necessarily understanding it in the moment that you're doing it. Some of what we do here as teachers is bring forth ideas because we're working through them. All of us are working through them ourselves all the time. And deepening that consciousness and becoming more and more the knowing. But it isn't as easy as breathing for the separated self, and yet it is, because it's consciousness that's creating the breath, creating life, creating the form, creating it all. And the more I tell myself that, whether my mind wants to agree with me or not, I want to keep telling myself what the truth is, because if the mind can learn the lies, it can also learn the truth. So I feel that's really important to reread these things and to keep taking them in and keep going deeper. Like I read this book years ago and coming back reading it again. I read it on my own, then I read the chapters with you guys, and every single time I awareness am aware that I am deepening my awareness. And I'm aware of Andrea deepening her understanding of the awareness simultaneously. And so one of the things I offer my clients is, you know, that bridge to help us understand ourselves as awareness is to actually declare before we start talking about something, is to say, I awareness am aware that Andrea is having thoughts about whatever. So it's the awareness aware of Andrea's thoughts, because there's no thoughts without awareness, because it's the knowing of it that creates the reality. So I keep doing that even on my own. I awareness am aware of feeling blah, blah, blah. So I'm joining Andrea and awareness together in that way. I'm not declaring myself I, Andrea.
Right.
Which is what I did my whole life.
Right. And this happens for each of us in different ways. It's like after the broadcast last week, I spoke to Hillary, and Hillary mentioning to me that James Francis, or Jimmy Twyman, is something that he said in the Moses Code. All of a sudden, she had like a full awakened experience from one sentence or one idea that was revealed to her in the Moses Code. And one idea can be revealed to us in one sentence. And all of a sudden we go, oh my God, I got it. I get it. Ah.
Well, that's why it's wonderful to have all the different hosts, because we all have created a language around it that has helped us understand it on our own, because it is an experience. The direct experiences are yours. And sometimes a client will say, well, Andrew, you're always talking about yourself. Sometimes they might misunderstand. I go, I'm teaching from direct experience. I'm not teaching you from a book. And I said, so my only direct experience is mine. I don't have your direct experience, but I want you to learn how to bring yours in and talk about that in a way that comes from the point of view of love and awareness of yourself. Yeah. And it's really powerful, and it's really been working well for a lot of people to make that transition from I being the body to I awareness of the body. Yeah. And so for me to share that might strike a chord with somebody, and somebody else goes, yeah, that's not going to work for me. And it doesn't matter, as long as if it helped one person, it helped me. So
it helps. It helps to, like you were saying a minute ago, to read something, and at first it may not be coming in, and then maybe on the third time, saying, now this is coming in, and it's because now there's an opening for a direct experience. It's not a concept. It's that's a little like, I'm not sure what that is. It becomes a known experience as the description invites us to notice it, or to be aware of the understanding, and then the understanding comes in.
Right, and it's also, Bill, you have these forums on tape for anybody to go back to anytime they want. Yeah. You know, again, to listen to it again, to listen to the different viewpoints, to have your book with you if you want. We all process individually in our own personal way. But we all are also still sharing the one consciousness that we all are. And it is that consciousness finding infinite ways and infinite possibilities of reminding itself of its truth, and remembering itself to its fullness and wholeness again. Yeah. Because it just appears to be seemingly separate. And so consciousness itself is not worried about the separate entity experience, because it knows that it's not. But it's also allowing itself the experience at the same time.
I like the, we're going to get to it in a minute, but I think it's the last chapter. I was not aware of this, but Rupert speaks of Ramana Maharshi that for a little while, he would be asked questions and then he would sit silent.
Yeah.
Because there would be no words that could adequately answer the question that was higher than the experience of silence.
Right.
I thought that was a remarkable statement of how that his mastery not only had the experience of that of what true aware presence is, which is no words, but then he was informed, or the body mind was informed in a way to express it or give the reflection of the direct experience of silence in using words to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in here, we are going to get to the language of the mind. On page 183, we talk about language here. So
Okay.
Around freedom.
Well, let's go there. We'll skip over 178 and go to 183 then, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, we're right on the subject, so I think it's sort of nice to just tie those things together. So,
all right, let's do
and
it.
here on the it says this, this lovely question here, and we were kind of talking about this just prior to this. It says, I often hear it said, this is right at the beginning, I often hear it said, there is nothing one can do with the thinking mind to achieve enlightenment. Is this so? The simple answer is yes, and then that inimitable but. The thinking mind is a series of abstract concepts with which we, as a culture, through our domestication, have agreed in common consent to represent our experience so as to enable us to communicate. And so one of the ways to communicate is language. And so language of the mind is a code. I love that. It converts direct experience into currency, which is just an exchange that can be used and exchanged for practical purposes of functioning at the level of the mind, body, and world. So we're all in agreement with the English language here, and we're using it to take our direct experiences, mine, yours, everybody's here, and sharing it the best we can from again, language itself is dualistic, and we're talking about wholeness, oneness, why silence works best in that situation. But if we want to help each other through, we generally do it through language, but there's also visuals and things like that. But so the language of the mind does not deliver the object that it represents, it indicates it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, however, this is where the but comes in from the beginning. However, we forget this and take the mind's formulations as true descriptions. And when I first read that sentence, I read it as deception, and then I laughed and I said, well, it kind of is. Instead of true descriptions, true deception of our experience. So we say, I see the car, which I was saying earlier, and in doing so, truly believe and feel that there is an I, an entity in here that does something called seeing, thereby enabling the I to experience it. That's what we believe. That's the edifice of which we've created. And as he said, there's nothing, and he said this true when we were doing freedom before and the other chapters when I was on last time. He said there's nothing wrong with this. It's when consciousness decides it's only a body that it's a problem.
Right. Yeah. That's when it seemingly loses itself in a separate experience.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that. We want to be and we do talk about language, and we talked about it last week, how it's not that easy to it's a challenge to talk about oneness with a dualistic language. And we're all doing the best we can. Right? So
Yes.
so it just enables a certain level of functioning in the world, the languaging of it. And it also gives each of us some insight into how we can move in this process of awareness, becoming more and more aware of ourselves as awareness. So it's only when we, as it says at the bottom, it's only when we take such a statement as a description of our actual experience as a description of reality. And the only reality to any experience is the knowing of it, not the visual of it, not the thoughts of it, but consciousness. So that's where the confusion begins, because we are seeing ourselves and understanding ourselves as a body. And that's really not what's happening. It's consciousness using language, using body as a way to remember itself, seemingly having forgotten itself. And I'll say seemingly because consciousness truly never forgets itself. It only appears to in the form of body, mind, experience.
Yeah, it's funny how when we describe these things, that we, all of us, have, we're being trained by the language, by the Rupert's language, by the understanding as it unfolds, as it matures. We're articulating it in this seemingly happens. This using seemingly is like the way that we're able to bridge the experience that seems to happen that never really occurs.
So it's a way for us to tell ourselves the truth.
Right.
While we're having an experience that doesn't actually feel like that. It's like, oh, okay, so I'm not a body, but boy, I sure do feel like I have one, right? And that's this is so real. That's why the experience of having a body feels so real. That's why thoughts feel real and feelings feel real and sensation. All of it is the reality of consciousness in its full self, having a complete experience of what it would be like to be a subject, entering a place called world and experiencing it. It's like our dreams at night, we go to sleep, but we need a subject to experience the dream and go into that dream. So, Andrea, this experience here is not, Andrea is not having a dream. Consciousness is having a dream of Andrea.
Right. Yeah. That's like the Mary and the Jane metaphor that Rupert uses. Let's move over to the, let's move,
not this one.
Yeah. Right.
Not the day.
Let's move over to the chat and pick up a few of the comments from the chat. Okay. Melissa says, pardon this anthropomorphic metaphor. Consciousness enjoys the bliss of holding up a mirror and looking at itself in the form of object. Mm-hmm. And that's true. That's exactly what Rupert is describing in that first chapter. Mm-hmm. And then Beatrice said, thank you, Andrea. Good to hear. I think that was something you were talking about in the very beginning when we were talking. And then Jenny says, Shannon says, Rupert says on page 71 that consciousness seems to forget itself. But we've been saying today, consciousness is all and always knows itself. It helps. And then Jenny answers that and says, Shannon, consciousness just seems to forget itself. It doesn't actually forget itself. But from the point of view of a separate self, it seems that consciousness has forgotten itself. It seems to have forgotten its unlimited eternal nature.
Right, that's what I was saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why we always sort of add the concession that it's seeming to do this, or when you use the word but or however, it's that concession, that language of concession that says, yeah, but in truth, nothing really is happening.
Right.
Consciousness never divests or loses itself. It just seems to do that.
It's the only thing that remains changeless.
Yes.
The experience.
Yes.
And because of that, we can have the experience.
Yes. Yes. And now here's a great question.
If it ever became the experience, we would stop having experience, because there would be no reality to it anymore. Consciousness would be gone. But that's not possible. That's what's so
Right.
fabulous.
Yes, yes. And Paula says that, as a question, so is awareness evolving through understanding here? As Andrea said, awareness knowing simultaneous as her understanding deepens. So that's
It's separated self. It's consciousness knows itself. You know, even as we said, it seemingly or apparently forgets itself when it chooses to take on a form.
Yes, yes.
But
It chooses to seemingly limit itself to have an experience, and it never loses. It just seems to lose itself when the experience is so fully invested in. It's no longer consciousness that is. It hasn't lost itself, but the separate self thinks that it is consciousness.
And that's how it deceives itself.
Right.
Right.
Jenny said, Paula, no, consciousness.
That's where the trouble
Jenny
begins,
says,
when you believe that you are the body with the mind.
Yeah, yeah. And that's where I don't know, it's where the lostness is experienced, and it's where you seem to suffer as the separate self. However, there is a way in which consciousness does come back into remembering.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it may take a long time.
Well, Rupert said that it is a slow process because, and I think you have to be very thorough in your self-investigation as you're asking different questions. I mean, if we're talking about seemingly and apparently, then we've already been asking different questions. And the mind is not going to lead us directly to it. The mind will pretty much, my experience has been very resistant for most of it. And I've had to find ways to, and one of them is repeating things that aren't there. That are there that my mind is not open to accept. We could say that. It doesn't welcome the ideas. It likes its old ideas because it's very attached to its conditioning. It's very attached to its belief system. It's very attached to being a body. And it doesn't feel safe to leave that. So for me, it feels like in order for something really to take place for the mind and body, it has to feel safe. And
yes, so I just want to say that first, Jenny answered that question from Paula and said, Paula, no, consciousness never changes, cannot change, cannot evolve. And I want to just add that what you're saying right now, Andrea, is that it sounds like when you say that you have to be very thorough, that sounds like something that the mind feels like it needs to take on. And I just want to caution that statement, because it's really the stillness of awareness that resolves all experiences.
And that's the I I'm referring to in the thoroughness.
But there's nothing to do, right? There's nothing. Awareness doesn't need to do anything that seems like it needs to be thorough.
To help the separated self, it does. It's still a separated self that feels separated and lost and unloved and not understood and not enough. There is that experience of that collapsed consciousness forgetting itself and having that experience. To remember itself, there is a process of the undoing of that, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and that sounds like a doer. That sounds like a doer that needs to somehow take part in the undoing that actually never happened.
That's how the mind sees it.
Right. So,
Yeah.
but the mind doesn't take part in anything that is that's the mind thinks that it's separate, right? So but it's not really doing anything.
It likes to think it is, though, and that helps it.
Right, right.
It's always
In my mind, it all takes place with desire. The desire to be happy is self-fulfilling, right? Because that's what happens. That's why people drink. That's why people do drugs. That's why people do things in excess, because they're looking for this experience of happiness, which is their true self. That's
well, there's some of that I agree with, and some that I don't agree with on that.
So Jenny says, I think Andrea means that when the mind raises objections or questions, we should follow them and investigate them. Exactly, not dismiss them. That's okay. We need to satisfy the mind, then that investigation takes us back to our true self beyond mind.
Thank you, Jenny. That's what I'm saying. Language again, not easy to manage.
Good.
But I'm not talking about the little I. I am speaking of I awareness, am aware of Andrea's thoughts, of feeling, resistance and all that. It's the awareness looking at that and bringing that awareness into Andrea's mind's awareness, bringing awareness into the experience of Andrea. Okay, Andrea, the apparent separate self that consciousness has decided to just, chooses to take a form called Andrea. And then there's all these aspects of Andrea that have come into deeply forgotten the truth of who she really is. And it is the undoing of that. And not doing something, but awareness. I understand that awareness, the I am awareness, is the process in which all of it gets resolved.
Yes, yes. And also, I agree that I totally think that your statement that the mind needs to feel safe, it almost needs to feel safe to unlock itself to the openness of its true experience.
Well, when somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I got to get rid of this," it's like, no, that's very frightening to a mind. Get rid of it feels, because it's attached to the body. It sees death. It's like you have to understand how the mind sees itself, and sees itself as this separate entity called Andrea. If we understand the process of how the mind sees, behaves, understands, reacts, gets triggered, and we can bring awareness to that, it's like, we talk about in here, the whole edifice got created. So it's the dismantling of that edifice, the dismantling of the belief systems of the mind, dismantling all this conditioning. And Don Miguel Ruiz calls it, in the Four Agreements, the domestication of humans, and through, reward and punishment. And this is where lying begins. We learn that a lie, going up into our head and making up a story, sometimes gets us out of a punishment. It's like, oh, that's really nice. I'm not going to hurt from that. And we get pulled into this other way of being in the world, and we go further and further and further and further away from the truth, and more and more into an isolation of being a body isolated in the world and vulnerable. And that's just not the truth. And so we have to dismantle all those beliefs, and that's what I'm talking about, is thoroughness.
Yes, got it.
Yeah.
And Beatrice says, and I've heard this many times. I've heard Muji say this, and I've heard many teachers refer to using the thorn to remove the thorn is using the mind, or using the, like you're talking about, using a thoroughness to investigate to remove the idea that there is a separate self.
So let's go to page 184.
Okay.
Down, let's see, this will help with all this.
Yes.
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes, this is talking about the whole thing. In fact, this looks like A Course in Miracles.
This is, I want to bring us here because this is really what I am talking. So, however,
Go ahead.
Dan can deconstruct the edifice of the belief. In fact, he is well placed to do so because he built it, or she built it, however you want to.
Yes.
That.
Yes.
He knows exactly how it was constructed, and by the same token, exactly how to deconstruct it. The deconstruction of the edifice is simply an investigation of the mind's beliefs that I is a separate personal entity, and the exploration, get my mouth working here, of the feeling that I is the body or is located in a body.
Right.
So a belief is an idea that we think is true, and a fact is an idea we know is true. So this is the dismantling the edifice is the process by which we distinguish between the two, the belief or a fact. And that's what I mean by thoroughness.
Yes.
Okay, so then it goes on the bottom. It says the presence of a doubt indicates, by definition, the presence of a belief underneath it. This is why you have to be thorough. Belief and doubt always come together. If a thought represents a fact, we know it. We do not believe it. And if we know it, we do not doubt it. If we doubt it, we do not know it. If we do not know it, it is a belief and not a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I wrote as a little note to myself is to know is not to think is not to know. Thinking is only engaged when it's asking questions, looking for answers. That is that separated self. And the awareness is the knowing self. And it doesn't need to think, it just knows. And that's why I said, a truth can come to you, arise out of it when you might be asking questions or wondering about something or repeating something that seems like an odd way to look at it, very different. Obviously, looking at everything from the point of view of awareness as opposed to the point of view of mind is a completely different way for all of us to do life.
Yes.
We've just been conditioned to go to the mind for everything. Even if you ask me a question, their eyes will go up. They're like they're looking up into the mind for the answer. And I go, no, look at me. The answer's not up there. You have it right here in your heart.
It's right here.
And as soon as I get them to engage and look just directly into my eyes, it's like emotion comes, a knowing comes. It's like there's like this opening, but you have to create a safe space for that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And
Audrey had a question or a statement. Why do we need to satisfy the mind? I think I'm confused with the mind as I think of the mind having an ego voice and the voice of the Holy Spirit. So I'm a little bit in a whirlwind. And thank you, Audrey, for that. And Jenny gave a perfect answer. And it says, unless we satisfy the mind, I think you're saying this thing, Andrea, unless we satisfy the mind, it will maintain its own beliefs and bring them back over and over again. Once it is satisfied, a space is created, and into that space, true understanding, not belief, arises.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of like resistance, when we put up a resistance, then we can't, there's not an opening for the conscious mind to actually see, because it's only seeing from the belief in its own separate identity. And when there's when it's safe to be open, then somehow the light comes in, and I see that the aha moment. Yeah. Oh, Hillary said the aha moment. Yeah. That's when it happens.
Safe is love. Love is this. Yeah. Love is a safe space. When people feel loved, they're willing to be more vulnerable. And in the vulnerability is the strength of where all this dismantling can happen. But dismantling doesn't happen, by reinforcing the mind and its old belief systems, it's introducing it to it's introducing it to the truth over and over again. And slowly but surely, the mind begins to remember the truth, because through direct experience, it's going, oh, it's, and that way, when I talked about the mind serving as part of it, it's, in other words, that it's like the joining of this, what seemed to be a separated self, starts to merge into the full awareness of the experience of a seeming separated self as just a consciousness having an experience. And for the most part, I would say a joyful one, unless it wants to disidentify and identify with body and suffer. And we talked the last time I was on, when the suffering gets really, really intense, that's when the bigger questions begin to be answered. When consciousness is done with the suffering, okay, I want to remember the happiness.
Yeah. Or the surrender takes place, and when the surrender takes place, the mind just somehow just gives up and leaves an open space.
It pretends to give up until it doesn't just give up. That's for sure. I can tell you for sure from the direct experience, it does not just give up. It says it wants to, and that's the bringing along. That's the creating more and more space for it to feel comfortable, to know the truth, to feel that nothing's going to happen to it, meaning the body and all this idea of itself. So, but also too, whenever the mind doesn't understand something, it assumes, and it creates a story. And that happens as children, and when we don't understand a lot of things, or when the parent says, well, and the child asks, well, why are you mad? You go, well, why do I have to do that? Because I said so. And there's no way to help the child understand something. And so we naturally want to, I believe consciousness is the understanding. So that aspect of us that is the understanding, when there isn't understanding, is seeking that, because it's seeking itself to know something. And somehow it knows that if it understands something, it's closer to itself and closer to a truth. And so when, as children, we don't understand something, we assume a lot, and then we create a belief around it, and then we live as if that belief is true. We never, ever question, is that true? And a lot of what this is to keep I find myself to keep asking a question, is it true? Is what you just said true, Andrea? Is what you just felt, does that feel true to you? Because truth is a feeling, it's a knowing, it's a sensation. It's like love and these other things that seem to be intangible. Consciousness did create itself into form as a subject and uses it to know itself, so it can know itself as truth. Because you can feel that sensation in the body, like you can feel anger and you can feel a lot of things. We kind of touched on this last week with Arthur, and just that we really do know ourselves, and we do know the truth. And whenever we hear it, we do respond to that. And each time we do, we get closer and closer to fully remembering and allowing, again, identifying with that truth, instead of disidentifying with it and going into the separated self. Yeah.
Melissa said something I think is accurate. She said conditioning occurs because it served a survival purpose, and it may feel threatening to try to just drop it. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's a form of denial that's used all the time. Mm-hmm. It must be shown that no harm occurs when the disidentification happens, right?
That's the safety.
Yeah. So that it can keep flying into the flame like the moth into the flame.
Yes. Yeah. So it's also on 186 at the bottom, it's also saying, since once we are using the mind, we are knowingly or unknowingly agreeing, at least temporarily, to its concepts and therefore its limitations. So we take a step down, so to speak, going on to 187, from the ultimate level of consciousness and agree to discuss the undiscussable, to think about the unthinkable, and to point towards that which cannot be named. And again, we go into the silence and the Ramana Maharshi and talking about that.
So why don't we close with these last three paragraphs from about Ramana Maharshi, because I think this is really interesting.
We already went through an hour? See, time is like this great illusion.
Are you there?
Yes. You can't hear me?
No, I lost my signal.
Oh, okay.
I'm back.
So
go ahead.
So should we read the last part of this chapter, which is talking on the path of discrimination, we discover what we are not. On the path of love,
Yes.
We discover what we are.
Yes.
Discovery is a moment by moment revelation. It cannot be crystallized in words. It is the true unknowing in which nothing is known, but everything is embraced.
Yes. Yes. And it says that many of us know that we are unlimited, but we feel limited.
Mm-hmm.
We have this like...
Because we're identified with the body.
Yeah, but we have a knowing. We have this knowing that there's more. We have this, there, like I remember as a 10-year-old, is this all there is? We're born and we die at 70 years old and it's over?
Ooh.
I remember thinking that as a 10-year-old.
That's because we were taught to believe in death, and we were taught that we're a body and it's going to die. We're not taught that we are pure consciousness having an experience, and that never dies. It isn't born, it doesn't live, and it doesn't die. It just always is. Yes. And that goes to that same the sentence, and that's what the mind, the contracted part of the forgetful part of itself, has such a problem with. And that's why we want it to remember what it is, so we can let go of the fear of death and this idea of the story of how we came to be. We were born in the heart and mind of consciousness, and that's where we are. That's where we'll always be. We've never left. There's no inside. There's no outside. There's no death. There's no birth. It's just this beautiful dream that God, call it God or just pure consciousness, is having, and we are all in that dream. And that's why
we are that.
As an entity, we don't have any freedom, because consciousness is consciousness's dream, and we're in it. You can't, because there is no entity to have a dream. It's got to be consciousness's dream.
I like this last sentence. It says, "We may understand the theory of non-duality, but in the privacy of our hearts, the fire of longing still burns." And that is what brings us to the pull of awakening. That's what brings us to the pull to know thyself, is that fire that's always burning. And the alarm clock that goes off for each of us is different, that brought us to this point.
Well, our tolerance for suffering is different.
Yes.
Some of us want to suffer just a little longer. So it's like, consciousness, that it said, when it's suffered enough, it decides to disidentify with body and start remembering itself. Consciousness.
In my mind, that also shows up. It showed up for me as a surrender when I called out to God and I said, "If you're real, please help me. I need help." And it was just like I surrendered to. I surrendered to the experience that took me to the next step. And we're at the top of the hour, and I think we have had a great discussion of these three chapters. And thank you, Andrea, for being our guest teacher this week. I think, is next week Jenny or Beatrice? Did you guys switch? Who's next week? Is it you, Beatrice? Is Beatrice still here? Did we lose her? Is it you, Jenny?
No, it's I think it's Beatrice,
okay.
And I'm doing the last one.
Okay, good. So Beatrice was here for a little while. I don't see her now, but I will do a check-in with you, Beatrice, if you follow up here and finish watching. Otherwise, I'll contact her and just make sure our connection is good. And thank you all for being with us this week. and I'll see you next week.
Love you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.